Hello, y'all. This video is going to be graphic. I have 2 disclaimers and 2 warnings, okay? This is where we are at. This is where we have come from with all this stuff that's going on. The video will explain it. Please watch till the end and let me know what you think.
One famous conference call a couple years ago where a military contractor said, war is not good for people, but man, it's really been great for business.
Since 9/11, defense contractors have seen their profits quadruple.
The war on terror is basically a welfare program for the military-industrial complex, the companies that provide the planes and the bombs, because it's incredibly profitable for weapons manufacturers. Just between 2016 and 2018, military spending went up 10%.
The infrastructure, the education, the healthcare, all of the things that we are failing in, they suddenly become disposable. Because we start asking Americans to sacrifice their well-being in the face of an opponent.
But who is that opponent? And why does it keep changing? And why are we still fighting?
The national emergency that was declared after 9/11 is still in place almost 20 years later and is being used for purposes that have nothing to do with 9/11.
The idea behind these military bases is that they're there for security. But you have to ask the question, do they render the United States more secure? I think you can see some reasons why hundreds of military bases might actually be counterproductive.
It's something that most Americans can't understand. People don't attack us because they hate our freedom. They don't attack us even because they hate our president. They attack us because they think we're wrong and that they're right. They view themselves as freedom fighters against people who are imposing their will over their sacred land and their sacred space.
As part of the ongoing war on terror, the U.S. government has put American troops in harm's way across the globe.
We talk about places like Afghanistan and Iraq often, but we rarely talk about places like Syria or Somalia, where there are regularly American troops in danger, where our assets are being utilized. What started out as the war on terror has become the forever war.
There is an armed conflict that we have been in since 2001 when Congress passed the authorization for use of military force, which authorized the president to use military force against those who planned 9/11 and who aided and abetted the planners. That really meant Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. So it's become kind of a blank check for whatever war making against terrorist organizations and the administration wants to engage in.
In 2019, U.S. Special Operations Forces were, at some point in that year, in more than 140 countries. I mean, that's a majority of the countries on our planet.
We end up in the situation that we're in right now, where we're involved in a seemingly endless war in countries across the world that most Americans couldn't even name. They wouldn't even be able to tell you all of the countries in which we're at war right now.
The government's decision to deploy troops is often only revealed by tragedy.
The degree to which many of the operations that are happening are so secretive that even the American people are not aware who the enemy is that we're fighting. A shocking state of affairs.
It's not just a forever war, it's an everywhere war. America is constantly at war everywhere around the globe. The sun never sets on our military operations because we have people in so many places around the world.
To our government's ability to wage war anywhere in the world at any time is a vast global network of military bases. This network of overseas U.S. military bases dates back to the early days of the Cold War, when the United States was locked in a struggle for global supremacy with the Soviet Union. In 1962, the Cold War almost ended in Armageddon, when Soviet nuclear missiles were discovered in Cuba.
I don't think the world has ever come closer to nuclear war than it did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The President of the United States had said he was willing to go to war to get the Soviet nuclear missiles out of Cuba.
But the installation of Soviet missiles on the island is only half the story.
The part that we leave out is that from Moscow's perspective, the thing started when the United States put missiles in its bases in Turkey, pointed at the Soviet Union.
The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade.
It becomes so easy in the United States to slip from this country is doing things that we in Washington don't like to something must be done.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. The price of indifference would be catastrophic.
Before it was even decided and discovered who had carried out the attacks of September 11th, you had members of the Bush administration who were looking for an opportunity to get within Iraq and exercise regime change from Saddam Hussein.
The part that we leave out is that from Moscow's perspective, the thing started when the United States put missiles in its bases in Turkey, pointed at the Soviet Union.
The U.S. had moved nuclear missiles into Turkey a year earlier, allowing America to destroy major Russian cities in minutes.
That, from Moscow's perspective, was the provocation and the reason that the Soviets retaliated by putting their missiles in Cuba.
As the American people prepared for nuclear war in 1962, they never knew the truth.
Lobbying Bill Clinton to fight Iraq, and they keep telling him this is the next big move in order to secure American security and American power.
But while the insiders failed to convince Clinton to invade, they found a willing partner in President George W. Bush.
Before it was even decided and discovered who had carried out the attacks of September 11th, you had members of the Bush administration who were looking for an opportunity to get within Iraq and exercise regime change from Saddam Hussein.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
And the reality is the furthest thing from mission accomplished.
I got to the city of Baghdad at the same time the president said the mission was accomplished.
Paul Rykhoff was an infantry officer in the National Guard, stationed in one of the city's most dangerous neighborhoods.
We arrived with no body armor, with no adequate vehicles, without water. We didn't have enough water to go around. The most powerful army the world has ever seen. And we had to scrap for ammunition and body armor.
But the troops were rushed into the region without adequate equipment, on the back of lies told about weapons of mass destruction.
Our vehicles are not armored. We're digging pieces of rusted scrap metal to put on our vehicles to take into combat.
As you know, you go to war with the army you have, and not the army you might want or wish to have at a later time.
Part of the problem that elites could insulate themselves from the destruction that they had wrought, and they could pursue their silly ideas that...
American General Smedley Butler once said, "War is a racket." And
it's the beginning of the age of catastrophe. It's kind of the future warning us about what's on the cards for us. Because the grim truth that I think we're not facing is that our civilization is now beginning to collapse in very real and very serious ways.
Most Americans are comforted in the belief that their government and the country's best and brightest will step up to protect them.
The entire idea of American exceptionalism and the illusion of national security is that we are strong and that we can take a blow, or that we'll protect Americans from some sort of major attack or some sort of cataclysm. But the truth is that we are very brittle right now.
We're always looking ahead to an America that never leaves anyone behind.
Just filming, just filming.
God.
But what if it turns out that the greatest threat in this age of catastrophe is that this idea that Americans will pull together in times of crisis is dead, killed by decades of treating American freedom as the freedom to get ahead at any cost?
During normal times, it's easy to think, the elite, the 1%, they're actually concerned about everybody's welfare. But then in that moment of crisis, when elites treat it as an opportunity for profiteering, rent-seeking, gouging from the public purse, that's the recipe for a failed state.
For over 70 years, our leaders have told us one thing under the bright lights.
The protection of the lives and property of Americans is the responsibility of all public officials.
I care. We're trying.
And it is my first duty as president to protect the American people. We have it so well under control.
But America's shadow government has spent trillions of dollars on secret plans that serve one premise. When the shit really hits the fan, we're on our own.
I have nothing.
And while the government leaves us to fend for ourselves, the elite suck us dry to fund their own escape. Since the Cold War, the threat of nuclear annihilation was real. But the story that we're somehow all in this together was closer to a cartoon.
The best protection of all is the special shelter built according to specifications of your local civil defense organization.
Instead of protecting the American public by reducing the threat, the U.S. government sinks billions of taxpayer dollars into new and more sophisticated weapons of mass destruction. One of those was codenamed Starfish Prime. The experiment was designed to test the effects of nuclear explosions in outer space. The explosion caused a massive electromagnetic pulse known as an EMP. The pulse fried electronics hundreds of miles away in Hawaii. It even blew out rows of streetlights in Honolulu. The Starfish Prime experiment exposes a frightening new possibility. Something as simple as a basic infrastructure failure could deal a fatal blow to America. It's a scenario that has troubled doomsday planners ever since. Because it's a lot easier to imagine the lights going out than a mushroom cloud over New York City. And when the basic things we all take for granted suddenly stop working, in the end, that may be just as destructive to our way of life. Has shown us that the boundaries between some distant future apocalypse and reality may be thinner than we'd like to believe. It has given us a preview of what things look like when our way of life starts to break down.
The fundamental basic institutions and structures of life that we took for granted have snapped apart like that.
What if the coronavirus is just a shot across the bow, a warning of what the future holds?
I think most people are very conflicted about this in the sense that we long for a return to normalcy. But there's also a part of us that says, normal isn't coming back. This is it.
We've already seen how fragile our supply chains are thanks to the pandemic. We got a little preview of it through things like farmers having to harvest their crops or slaughter their livestock, but not being able to bring them to market, and so they just destroyed it because small elements in the logistics broke down. If there's a total breakdown, that's going to be a lot more frightening. You'll recall that at the start of the pandemic, there was a widespread toilet paper shortage. So multiply that, minor inconvenience, and it probably cascades.
The government will tell you that when there's a disaster, you could be on your own for the first 72 hours. But if a cataclysmic disaster really happens, not everyone assumes that the government, or anyone for that matter, is really coming to help.
Rich people in government, they take care of themselves, but for the middle class and for lower income folks, you're absolutely on your own.
In the foothills of the Colorado Mountains is a secluded camp called Fortitude Ranch. It's run by Drew Miller, with a PhD in public policy from Harvard. He's a respected figure in what used to be considered a fringe movement.
We kind of had a phrase decades ago in the prep industry called 72 hours to animal, saying that, for the first couple of days, people will react okay, but eventually when there's no food, no water, and panic starts spreading, people are going to get to their basic instincts of survival, and it's going to be laws. We don't believe that anymore. We believe it's more like 72 seconds or 72 minutes to animal. Chaos is going to break out within the first hour or hours. Government's number one priority is taking care of themselves. Police number one priority, continuity of government, taking care of the elected officials. No one is going to be responding to your call for help at your little house saying, hey, there's a marauding group coming through, breaking into houses, taking goods and stealing. So if you're a government official, you'll be taken care of, but the rest of us, we're pretty much on our own.
I think people are scared shitless about two things. They're related. The first is the idea that we have built a technological society whose comforts we are reliant upon, whose coordination we need to sustain our current population. That if you just turned off all the machines tomorrow, that kind of handmade version of our society where all the crops were brought in by hand and so on would provoke mass die-offs. The story we've been sold is part of the other fear, which is that our institutions are no longer trustworthy, that they have become not truth-seeking exercises, but rather auction houses in which people who are powerful and wealthy can buy a version of the truth that suits their parochial ends. In a world in which the Sacklers successfully convinced the FDA that opioids weren't dangerous and kickstarted an opioid epidemic that killed 200,000 Americans, more than died in Vietnam, and where the Sacklers themselves became richer than the Rockefellers, how do you trust an institution?
Very, very quickly, the distance between the importance by which the government seeks their own survival and the survival of the American people. This idea of national security would collapse almost instantaneously.
But in the age of catastrophe, it doesn't really take an EMP to see what happens when the lights go out. And our basic institutions start to fail us. We all just lived through 2020.
So what happens when somebody now doesn't have a job, doesn't have the basic kind of access to resources that we take for granted in the rich world? You turn on the tap, water doesn't come out. You go to the store and there's not enough food. You press the button and there's no electricity. What happens? Well, history tells us when people grow suddenly poor, what happens is massive waves of authoritarianism and fascism. History tells us that in absolutely unsparing terms. So that's the story of Weimar Germany becoming Nazi Germany. It's the story of Stalinist Russia. It's the story of the Islamic world. It's also the story of America today.
What if the doomsday scenario that politicians planned for since the Cold War turned out to be a lot less obvious than a nuclear bomb or EMP? What if it's our economy and the collapse has already begun?
You're all set. Have a wonderful apocalypse.
It feels like this is what the beginning of doomsday and the apocalypse might feel like.
This is a government suitcase.
kitchen, giving free meals to these men who were once skilled workers in a factory. American plans involved almost nothing to ensure the survival of ordinary Americans, but they were concerned with what to do with those who somehow survived. The engineers of the apocalypse turned to the IRS.
The joke is that there are only two constants in life, death and taxes. And so even in a nuclear attack, that held true. And if one didn't get you, the IRS wanted to make sure that the other did.
While those impractical government plans are sitting on a shelf somewhere, when a real economic emergency actually arises, the government is left scrambling to find a way out. Across America, roughly 3 million homes are foreclosed on, turning parts of cities into ghost towns. The economy faces a meltdown, and so the government steals a page from its nuclear playbook. The elite gets saved, only this time, it's not in bunkers under mountains of concrete. It's under mountains of cash.
About how to water test their plans for the apocalypse, for the electromagnetic pulse, or the economic downturn, or the disease or war that would necessitate them leaving their Silicon Valley ranches and retreating to these fortified bunkers in the middle of nowhere.
Cold War till now, the most powerful people end up being the ones most afraid.
There's going to be, the social unrest that leads to your undoing, which is, it's really easy to puncture a hole in their plan.
Ridiculous their ideas are. And they really think that they can play gilded survivalists when the society that they're ripping off collapses. And they can't.
Behind the thinking of the Cold War's doomsday planners is a strange mentality. It's okay to destroy the planet and kill nearly everyone on it. Because if you're one of the elite, you get to survive.
These crazy Cold War bunkers are like fantasy landscapes. They're kind of like monuments to elite delusion and paranoia. Because they won't work, but they embody this self-justification. Yeah, sure, we can invest billions of dollars, trillions of dollars in atomic weapons, and even use them, and civilization will survive. That's deranged thinking.
I'm going to lay the facts before you, the rough with the smooth. Some of these security facts are reassuring. Others are not. They are sternly demanding.
The virus has widened the already enormous wealth gap in America. Radical inequality often leads to revolution. And as far as the 1% are concerned, the guillotines are coming.
During normal times, the story we get from elites is that anyone can become rich if you just work hard enough, and anyone who's poor, it's basically their fault. Well, when suddenly everybody is suffering economically, that stuff goes out the window. It's ideologically destabilizing, and I think there's a possibility that people will start seeing through all these myths and start seeing the situation for what it is, which is a struggle between classes, between
incapable of actually creating a future in which everything's going to be okay.
People who believe the disinformation, misinformation, we've seen.
Where science is met with righteous ignorance.
You literally cannot mandate somebody to wear a mask knowing that that mask is killing people. It literally is killing people.
That signal means to stop whatever you are doing and get to the nearest safe place fast.
Your survival chances against dangerous fallout are excellent if you take suitable shelter.
Fed a double dose of terror and deception.
An attack could come without warning.
In a pinch, dig a foxhole and make a cover of branches or board. Don't let radioactive dust touch your skin.
And while Americans are distracted by civil defense drills, The government and military contractors get busy acquiring the real power and wealth that comes from manufacturing tens of thousands of nuclear weapons that could threaten American democracy. So in his farewell address,
we have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportion.
Ike says the quiet part out loud, that Cold War planning is secretly transferring previously unimaginable power into a very few hands, all unaccountable to the people.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
The government has engaged in the covert overthrow of democratically elected leaders across the world. We know that the government has engaged in the forced sterilization of prisoners, medical experimentation on children in state care, CIA agents setting up brothels in San Francisco to test the effects of acid and other drugs on unsuspecting Johns.
The